Montana Territory, early spring of 1880, the wind still carried winter's breath when she came down the hill dragging a broken wagon and 3 children behind her. Vance Zellar had just finished splitting a stack of pine logs outside his cabin when he spotted the figures. A woman in a threadbare dress, sunken with exhaustion, clutching a worn bonnet in one hand and her youngest child on her hip. 2 others, a boy and a girl, clung to her skirts, their boots caked in mud. The wagon axle was cracked clean through, one wheel tilted like a dead limb. They were 10 yards into his land and too desperate to care. He dropped the axe and headed toward them. "You lost," he called out. The woman looked up, wary but not afraid. Her voice was hoarse. "Not anymore." Vance stepped closer, eyes scanning the children, thin but alert. The boy stood in front of his sisters, jaw set like a man twice his age. "I am Delaney Kirk," she said. "We came from Kansas. My husband died last winter. Fever, we had nowhere else to go." "Why here?" she hesitated. "A man my husband worked with spoke of the valley past the ridge. Said the land was kind and the men kinder." Vance nodded toward the cabin. "You can rest here, get warm." Delaney's spine straightened. "We do not want charity." "I am not offering charity," Vance said. "I am offering firewood and hot broth." The little girl, maybe 7, tugged her mother's hand. "Mama, please." Delaney's lips trembled before she nodded. Inside, the cabin was clean and quiet. Vance stirred coals to life and added more wood. He ladled stew from his pot, venison and potato, and set bowls down for each of them. The children ate like they had not in days. The littlest one, no older than 3, curled up beside the hearth and fell asleep with her thumb in her mouth. Delaney sipped slowly, eyes darting between her children and Vance. "I never intended to trespass." "You did not," he said. "You came looking for land, same as I once did." She looked out the window. "Is it yours?" "Bought it with blood and sweat 10 years back. Built this place with my own hands." Delaney set her bowl down. "I need to find work. I can clean, cook, mend. My boy can help with livestock, and the oldest girl's good with a needle. We can pay our way." Vance leaned back in his chair. "What you need is rest." "And a plan." She met his gaze for the first time. Her eyes were tired but clear. "What I need is for my children to be safe. I buried their father in a frozen ditch. I will not bury another." Vance nodded once. "Then stay for tonight." Outside, the wind picked up again. By morning, Delaney had cleaned his entire cabin, boiled his linens, and started bread. The children were out stacking split logs. Vance watched from the porch. He could see the way the boy Forrest, she had said, kept checking on his sisters, how he stood between them and anything unfamiliar. Vance had known that kind of fear once, the kind that makes a child grow up too fast. "I will clear the wagon," Vance said. "You will not get far with it like that." Delaney wiped her hands on her skirt. "You do not need to, I know." He repaired the axle by noon, bolting new timber from his own stock. When he looked up, Delaney was standing beside him, sleeves rolled, ready to help. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. Vance met her eyes. "Because I know what it is to be alone." That night, Delaney sat at the table after the children were asleep. Her hands were red from scrubbing, but her face had softened. Vance poured her a cup of coffee, the last of it, and slid it across the table. "I can offer you work," he said. "A place to stay, but folks around here, they talk. A woman alone with 3 children and no man, they will not make it easy. I do not care what they say, but your children will feel it." Delaney looked down into the cup. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Vance said carefully, "that I could offer more than work." Her eyes lifted. "I could offer marriage." Silence stretched. The fire popped in the hearth. "I am not looking for pity," she whispered. "This is not pity, this is choice." "Mine." Delaney stood slowly. Her voice cracked. "You do not know me." "I know enough. I know you crossed half the country with 3 children and a busted wagon. I know you kept them alive through winter and loss. I know you are stronger than anyone I have ever met." She took a step toward him. "This is not how people fall in love." "No," he said, "but it might be how they start." Delaney looked at the door to the children's room, then back at him. "If I agree, it is not for convenience." "Nor for me," he said. She held out her hand. "Then we try." Vance took it. Her fingers were rough but warm. Outside, the wind had calmed. The land was still and quiet, as if holding its breath. Inside the cabin, something shifted. a beginning small and certain. The morning sun rose pale behind thin clouds, casting long blue shadows across the frost-bitten field behind the cabin. Vance had already taken the mule out to check the southern fence line when Delaney stepped outside, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched him from the edge of the porch, one hand resting lightly against the post, the other clutching a basket of mended clothes she'd washed the day before. The children were still inside, the oldest girl, Clara, helping her younger sister button her dress while Forrest boiled oats over the hearth. Delaney could hear their voices through the cabin walls, soft, steady, untroubled for the first time in many months. Vance returned by noon, his coat damp and boots caked with thawing soil. He led the mule into the lean-to and set down a pair of rusted wire cutters on the table inside. "Fence'll need new posts before summer," he said, brushing his palms on his pants. "If you're set on planting anything, you'll want to start marking rows next week." Delaney set a tin plate of salt pork and beans in front of him. "I thought maybe carrots and cabbage, something that keeps." He nodded once, grateful. "You've got good sense." She poured water into a chipped mug and sat across from him. "I was raised on a tenant farm outside Emporia. My father kept his own seed tin, said never to trust the store-bought kind." Vance chewed thoughtfully, watching her hands as they folded and unfolded the edge of her apron. "You left family behind." "I did," she said. "My sister married into a dry goods family in Lawrence," I wrote once. Didn't hear back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The wind had stilled again, and the cabin creaked gently in the quiet. Vance leaned back. "You want this marriage to be proper, I can take us down to the preacher in town." Delaney's eyes flicked to the door where the children lingered just out of sight. "I don't want them hearing whispers when we go for supplies. I don't want them looked at like there's something to pity." "They won't be," he said. "Not while I draw breath." She looked at him then, long enough that he felt the weight of her trust settle between them like something earned. "I'll ride out tomorrow," he said. "Ask Reverend Hill to come up the ridge. That all right?" Delaney reached across the table and touched his wrist. "Yes." The next day came with spits of sleet and a biting wind. Vance saddled his gelding and left before dawn, leaving Delaney with instructions to stay inside and use the kindling stacked near the hearth. She nodded, but after he was gone, she stepped outside with Forrest and walked the perimeter of the root cellar, checking for gaps or signs of rot. Clara trailed behind with a basket, collecting stray feathers from the chickens and humming under her breath. By the time Vance returned with Reverend Hill riding beside him, the sky had cleared just enough to let in the last of the afternoon light. Delaney met them at the gate, her dress brushed clean and her hair pinned up in a way that made Vance pause before dismounting. Reverend Hill was a kind-faced man with silver streaks in his beard and ink stains on his fingertips. He carried a worn Bible and a small satchel with a bottle of cider and a linen collar tucked inside. "We'll hold it here," Vance said, nodding toward the cabin, "if that's acceptable." Delaney stepped aside to let the men in. "We've got bread warming and I boiled coffee grounds twice. It's bitter but strong." The children stood quietly in the corner as the Reverend read the vows. Forrest kept one hand on his sister's shoulder, but his eyes never left Vance. The boy was measuring him, not just as a man, but as something more sacred, someone who might stay. When the final words were spoken and the prayer offered, Vance took Delaney's hand and placed it against his chest, just above the scar that ran beneath his shirt. She didn't ask about it. She didn't need to. That night, after the Reverend had ridden back down the ridge and the children were folded into quilts beside the fire, Vance sat beside Delaney on the edge of the porch. She held a tin cup of cider between her palms, breathing in its warmth. "I didn't come here looking for a man," she said. "I came looking for a place where my children wouldn't be hungry." Vance nodded, his voice low. "And I didn't expect to share this land again. But I kept the second room built, just in case." Delaney looked at him then, not with hesitation, but with a quiet steadiness that had grown over days of shared labor and silence. "We'll make it work." "We will," he said, and laid his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. The moon rose slow and golden over the trees, and for the first time in a long while, neither of them looked back. The thaw came slow that year. Snow pulled back in patches, revealing the hard, packed earth beneath like a wound that hadn't quite healed. By mid-April, the creek behind the cabin had begun to run louder, fed by meltwater from the higher ridges. Vance had cleared a stretch of land beside the stable for planting, and Delaney spent her mornings pacing the soil with Forrest, measuring rows with twine and stakes. She knelt often, pressing her palm flat against the dirt, eyes narrowed in concentration. "It'll hold," she said one morning, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Not rich, but honest." Vance stood a few feet off, holding a spade. "That was my reed, too." Clara and her sister, Ruthie, were inside with a needle tin and a pile of torn muslin Delaney had bartered from a neighbor. They were stitching together sacks for storing roots come harvest. The girls worked in companionable silence, pausing now and again to count stitches or pass thread. After the rows were marked, Delaney stood and stretched her back, brushing dust from her knees. "There was a woman in our town once," she said, glancing toward the trees. "Married a man she didn't know. He drank, left her with 2 infants and a broken jaw. Folks said it was her fault, that she should have seen it coming." Vance lowered the spade. "You worried I'll turn like that?" "No," she said simply. "But I think about what kind of man my children'll remember growing up beside. I think about what they'll carry forward." Vance looked at the edge of the tree line where the pines swayed slow and steady. "My father used to say a man shows his worth in quiet ways, not with fists, not with boasts. With how he keeps his word, how he leaves things better than he found them." She considered that. "Did he?" "No," Vance said. "He didn't." That night, after the girls were asleep and Forrest had retired to the loft he now called his own, Delaney sat by the hearth with a small wooden box in her lap. She opened it slowly, revealing a handful of letters, a broken pocket watch, and a faded photograph of a man in Union blue. She set it down gently on the floor between them. "Elias," she said. "He was 29, never saw battle, spent the war laying track for supply trains." Vance leaned forward, studying the image. "You loved him." "I did." Her voice caught a little, but she didn't look away. "He was gentle. Never raised his voice, would have done anything for the children." "What would he think of this?" Vance asked softly. Delaney ran her thumb along the edge of the photograph. "I think he'd be grateful they're warm, fed. I think he'd want me to stop looking backward." She closed the box and set it aside. "I haven't forgotten him, but I'm not asking you to replace him." "I wouldn't try," Vance said. "I just do right by you and them." That night when she reached for his hand, it was not hesitant, it was sure. Late spring brought the first hints of green. Tiny shoots curled up from the rows Delaney and Forrest had planted, and the chickens began laying regular again. Clara had taken it upon herself to gather in the eggs each morning, careful and proud in equal measure. Ruthie followed closely behind, always with a question or a story, her voice bright in the morning stillness. One evening, after the sun dipped low and cast the fields in amber, Vance and Forrest stood side by side fixing a loose hinge on the barn door. The boy held the lantern steady, eyes sharp. "You don't have to keep checking my work," Vance said without looking up. Forrest shifted his grip on the handle. "I just like knowing what you're doing." Vance tightened the bolt, then turned to him. "You think I mean your ma harm?" "No," Forrest said. "But I still need to be sure." "That's fair." The boy nodded once, then set the lantern down. "Did you ever have a son?" "No," Vance said, returning the wrench to his belt. "Didn't think I'd ever have a family." Forrest studied him a moment. "You do now." The boy walked back toward the house, shoulders square. By the time Vance entered the cabin, Delaney had laid out 2 bowls of lentil stew and was brushing a curl of steam from her face. She looked up when he came in, eyes soft. "He's warming to you." "I know," Vance said, shrugging off his coat. "He's got good reason not to trust easy." Delaney offered a faint smile. "He'll follow your lead if you keep steady." "I plan to." She reached across the table, fingers brushing his wrist. "So do I." Outside, a whip-poor called once, then again. The fire crackled low, and in that quiet moment, the shape of their life together settled into place, not hurried, not grand, but true. By early May, the wind carried warmth instead of warning, and the sky had softened to that pale, steady blue that meant rain would come soon, but not today. Vance was carving a new yoke for the mule behind the stable when Delaney came out barefoot, her hem pinned up to her knees with clothespins, a bundle of fresh picked nettle cradled in her arms. "I want to try a poultice," she said, setting the bundle on the bench beside him. "For Clara's joints. She's been stiff in the mornings." Vance wiped wood shavings from his lap. "She say something?" "No, but she favors her left side when she crouches. I've seen it," he nodded, impressed. "You ever worked with nettle before?" "My mother did." "She used to say it stings when it's doing its job." Vance smiled faintly and stood. "You need a fine cloth to wrap it." "I was thinking that piece of muslin Forrest tore last week." "That'll do. You want help grinding it?" She shook her head. "I'll use the pestle. Keeps my hands steady." He watched her walk back toward the cabin, the sun catching the curve of her neck where her braid had come loose. She didn't move like someone trying to prove anything, just a woman who noticed what needed doing and did it. That evening, once the girls were tucked in and Forrest had finished oiling the hinges on the cabin door, Delaney sat beside the hearth with a small bowl in her lap, stirring the nettle mash with a wooden spoon. Vance pulled up a chair and rolled his sleeves to his elbows. "She let you test it, didn't ask." Delaney dipped the cloth into the mixture and folded it carefully. "I wrapped it around her knee while she was sleeping." "Bold, she's stubborn, gets it from both sides." Vance leaned back in his chair. "You think about schooling for them?" He nodded. "I have," she said. "Clara's quick with numbers. Ruthie's not ready yet, but she has a good memory. Forrest, he's not built for a desk, but he reads when he thinks no one's watching. There's a circuit teacher passes through once a month, stays with the preacher's wife. Teaches out of a room above the livery." Delaney set the cloth aside. "Would she allow it? She's taken in other children. You'd have to ask." Delaney looked into the fire. "I don't want them treated like charity." Vance stirred the coals with the poker. "They won't be. They've earned every bit of their place." She brushed her hands on her apron and stood quiet for a moment. "You ever think about what kind of father you'd be?" "I used to," he said. "Not lately," and now he met her eyes. "I think I'd listen more than I talk. I'd teach what I know. I'd show them how to hold steady even when things go lean." Delaney stepped closer. "That's enough." The firelight played across her face, turning her eyes the color of molasses. She reached for his hand, fingers lacing slowly with his. Outside, the crickets had started up, and the moon hung low behind the ridge. Inside, the room was warm, the air thick with the scent of nettle and ash. Later, when the fire had gone to embers and the house was still, Delaney lay beside him with one hand resting lightly on his chest. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she murmured. "You are," he said. "With me, you are." Her breath deepened, and he held her close, letting the silence settle the way it does when two people have nothing left to prove. The land beyond the cabin waited, fields to till, fences to mend, a world to build. But for now, in the hush of night, their joined lives had begun to root, quiet and certain, like seeds deep in spring soil. By early June, the earth had warmed enough to work barefoot, and Ruthie spent her mornings weaving flower crowns from wild yarrow and binding them with thread Clara had saved from her sewing basket. Delaney let her, as long as the eggs got gathered and the wash was hung chores first, then play. Vance had started breaking ground further south to build a smokehouse. The salted venison wouldn't last them past summer, and with wedding gifts from neighbors a sack of barley, 2 milk goats, they had more to preserve than he'd planned for. Forrest had taken to rising earlier than the others. Vance found him most mornings in the lean-to, oiling the mule's harness or sharpening the drawknife without being told. "You ever think about building?" Vance asked one morning, handing the boy a rasp. "With wood, with your hands," Forrest nodded. "I like the quiet of it. You've got the patience, that's rare." The boy didn't say anything, but later that day he stayed behind after supper to help Vance notch the first beams for the smokehouse frame. He didn't ask questions, just watched, learned, and mirrored the work. Vance didn't speak on it. He knew better than to name a thing before it fully took root, but something in the boy had settled. Delaney, meanwhile, had begun trading with the widow Harmon down the ridge, a woman who kept bees and made a thick, sharp soap from lye and boiled spruce. Delaney returned one afternoon with a jar of honey and a small, hand-bound book of herbal recipes. "She said you might want this," she said, setting it on the table. Vance turned the pages carefully. "You're good with plants." Delaney nodded, untying her kerchief. Elias never took to them, thought everything could be fixed with rest and water. "But there's more to healing than that." She didn't say more, but Vance heard the edge that lived in her voice when she spoke of her first life, the one that ended before she crossed the last state line. He never asked for details. He only listened. Later that week, Clara asked if she could spend her afternoons with Mrs. Hutton, the preacher's wife, helping organize the scraps of scripture and arithmetic charts she rotated through her schoolroom. Delaney hesitated only a moment before agreeing. The walk to town wasn't short, but Forrest volunteered to escort her, and Vance gave him his second-best knife to carry. "Not for show," he said. "Only if needed." "I know," Forrest said, tucking it into his boot. When they returned that evening, Clara was glowing, her arms full of paper and a small slate board with a chunk of chalk tied to it. "She let me read from the blue primer," she told Delaney breathlessly, "said I had a clear voice." Delaney kissed her forehead. "You do?" Vance watched her from the doorway, her hand lingering on Clara's curls just a second longer than needed. He didn't know what it felt like to be mothered, but he saw in Delaney's children the quiet strength of it. That night, after the girls had curled together in their bed and Forrest was upstairs with a book on homesteading Vance had lent him, Delaney joined him outside beneath the stars. The air was warm and thick with pine resin. She carried 2 mugs of boiled chicory. "Mrs. Hutton wants Clara to help twice a week through summer," she said, handing him one. "You all right with that?" "I am." She paused. "I used to think leaving Kansas meant giving them less. Less school, less comfort, less chance, but it's not less, is it? It's just different. They've got a roof, a fire, a future." She turned toward him, face lit by the faint orange glow from the cabin window. "And I've got you." Vance slid a hand over hers, thumb brushing her knuckles. "It took me a long time to believe I deserved this." She leaned into his shoulder. "Me too." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that said everything worth saying had already been understood. By mid-July, the first squash blossoms had opened, and Clara could recite half of Psalm 23 from memory. Ruthie had started naming the goats and insisted on brushing them before supper. Forrest had built a small shelf in the barn's corner for tools, lining them up with care and pride. Delaney's hands were stained from chamomile and comfrey root, and Vance had a new scar across his forearm from a slipped chisel, but neither complained. On a Sunday, Reverend Hill returned, not for ceremony this time, but to share a meal. He brought a jar of pickled beans and a tin of pipe tobacco. "You've made this place a home," he said to Delaney as she ladled stew into his bowl. She nodded. "It's the first one that's ever fit." That night, Vance pulled a small parcel from beneath the bed. He handed it to her without words. Inside was a comb not new but polished bone, carved with a pattern of pine needles. "I know it's not much," he said. She drew the comb through her hair, the weight of it familiar, grounding. "It's everything." That evening they lay in bed with the windows open, the breeze carrying the scent of wild mint through the cabin. Her head rested on his chest and his arm curled around her waist. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The ache of old grief had softened into something livable, and what remained between them was solid, earned. Years passed, but the cabin never emptied. Clara became a teacher. Ruthie tended bees and grew sunflowers beside the barn. Forrest cleared land of his own, 2 ridges over, and built a cabin with timber he felled himself. Vance helped him raise the roof. Delaney packed bread and salt pork for the crew. No one asked for thanks. Delaney's herbs lined the kitchen shelves, labeled in her careful script. Vance built her a bench beneath the east window where she could sit with her ledger and watch the fields. She never asked for more. She never had to. They grew old together, not in grand declarations, but in small acts, sharpened blades, mended hems, quiet evenings with hands clasped and hearts steady. And when the land bloomed each spring and the creek ran high and the wind carried laughter from the porch where grandchildren played, Vance would turn to Delaney, his voice low and sure. This, he'd say, was worth every mile. And Delaney always would answer, "We made it home."